In 1873, a 60-year-old farmer named Joseph Glidden stood at the DeKalb County Fair in DeKalb, Illinois, a small town about 65 miles west of Chicago, and stared at a wooden rail covered with sharp metal points. It was an exhibit by Henry Rose, who'd patented his thorny fence earlier that year on May 13th. The rail was designed to be attached to existing fences to keep livestock from breaking through. Glidden studied it carefully. He was a practical man. He'd been farming in DeKalb County since 1843, 30 years of working the land, understanding cattle, knowing what worked and what didn't. And as he looked at Rose's invention, he saw something the inventor had missed. Within a year, Joseph Glidden would file a patent for an improvement that would change the American West forever. His invention would end the cattle drives, close the open range, spark a war in Texas that caused $20 million in damage, and reshape millions of acres from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. They called it the Devil's Rope, and for thousands of cattlemen who'd relied on unfenced grasslands stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction, that's exactly what it was. Before barbed wire, the American West faced an impossible problem. How do you build fences when there's no wood? From eastern Kansas westward across the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains, a distance of roughly 700 miles, trees were scarce. In much of Texas, the same problem existed. The Llano Estacado in the Texas Panhandle stretched for more than 30,000 square miles with virtually no timber. Settlers building homes on the plains used sod, cutting thick blocks of prairie grass and dirt and stacking them like bricks. An entire house made of earth because lumber was that expensive. Rail fences required split logs. Rock walls required stone. Osage orange hedges, sometimes called hedge apple trees, took years to grow dense enough to contain livestock. Some farmers in Kansas and Nebraska planted these living fences in the 1860s and 1870s, but a useful hedge required 5 to 7 years of growth. The settlers didn't have 5 years. They needed fences now. Smooth wire existed, but cattle learned quickly that they could lean against it, stretch it, and break through. A 1,000-pound Longhorn steer felt no particular respect for a thin strand of metal wire. The problem was universal across the frontier, and it meant that for decades, the West operated under a system called open range. The open range was simple. Cattle roamed freely across unfenced grasslands. A cattleman in Texas might graze his herd on public land, stretching for 50, 70, even 100 miles in any direction. Water holes were communal. Grass belonged to whoever got there first. The cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, covering distances of 800 to 1,000 miles, only worked because the land was open. 3,000 head of Longhorns walking 15 miles a day needed to graze as they traveled. Fences would have made that impossible. But in 1873, everything changed. At that DeKalb County Fair, 3 men saw Henry Rose's thorny fence rail. Joseph Glidden was one. Isaac Elwood, a hardware merchant, was another. Jacob Haish, another local farmer, was the third. All 3 went home and started experimenting. Glidden's wife Lucinda, some say she helped him, though history hasn't given her much credit, watched as Joseph set up his workshop. He took a coffee mill from the kitchen, modified it, and used it to create small metal barbs. Then he did something brilliant. He took 2 strands of wire and twisted them together, trapping the barbs between the twisted strands. The twisting held the barbs in place. The barbs made cattle respect the fence. The double strand made the wire strong enough to handle tension. He called it the winner. On October 27, 1873, Glidden filed his patent application. Jacob Haish filed his competing S-barb design in July 1874. The legal battle would rage for nearly 20 years, eventually reaching the United States Supreme Court. But on November 24, 1874, Joseph Glidden received patent number 157,124 for his improvement in wire fences. He was 61 years old, and he was about to become one of the richest men in America. Glidden partnered with Isaac Elwood to form the Barbed Fence Company in DeKalb. They needed to prove their invention worked. More importantly, they needed to prove it to the one place where fencing mattered most: Texas. In 1876, a salesman named John Warren Gates, who would later earn the nickname Bet a Million Gates for his gambling habits, brought Glidden's wire to San Antonio. He set up a demonstration on Alamo Plaza, right in the heart of the city. Gates built a corral using 4 strands of Glidden's barbed wire. Then he filled it with some of the most ornery Texas Longhorn cattle he could find, animals that had lived half wild with horns spanning 5 to 6 feet, descendants of Spanish stock that had roamed the Texas brush country since the 1600s. A crowd gathered. Ranchers placed bets. Nobody believed wire could hold a Longhorn. Gates supposedly told the crowd the wire was light as air, stronger than whiskey, and cheap as dirt. The Longhorns charged the fence. They hit the barbs. They backed off. They tried again. The wire held. The ranchers were convinced. Orders poured in. By 1880, just 6 years after Glidden's patent, more than 80 million pounds of barbed wire had been sold. Manufacturing companies in New York, Illinois, and Kansas were producing wire as fast as they could make it. In 1876, Glidden sold his patent rights to the Washburn and Moen Manufacturing Company of Massachusetts for $60,000, about $1.8 million in today's money. But he kept royalties, and he kept investing. By the time of his death in 1906, Glidden was worth over $1 million, the equivalent of roughly $31 million today. His assets included the Glidden House Hotel, the DeKalb Chronicle newspaper, 3,000 acres of farmland in Illinois, and 35,000 acres in Texas. The man who'd stood at a county fair in 1873 had become wealthier than he'd ever imagined, but his invention had consequences he couldn't have predicted. To understand what barbed wire did to Texas, you need to understand the scale of the open range. The Chisholm Trail, the most famous cattle drive route, ran from South Texas to Abilene, Kansas. That's roughly 800 miles. Cowboys drove cattle along that trail for months, grazing on unfenced public land the entire way. The Western Trail, which eventually replaced the Chisholm Trail, stretched even farther, from Bandera, Texas to Dodge City, Kansas, and beyond to Montana. Over 1,000 miles. Between 1866 and 1886, an estimated 10 million cattle walked these trails north. The entire industry depended on open, unfenced grasslands. But starting in 1874, barbed wire began appearing across Texas. Large ranchers bought thousands of acres and fenced them. The wire was cheap, far cheaper than lumber. A mile of 4-strand barbed wire fence cost about $200 to build, including posts and labor. Compare that to a rail fence, which might cost $1,000 per mile or more. Ranchers could suddenly afford to enclose enormous properties, and some of them got greedy. In Coleman County, Texas, roughly 200 miles northwest of San Antonio, a woman named Mabel Day ran an 85,000-acre ranch. Her husband, William, had died in 1881 from injuries sustained in a stampede, leaving her with a 6-month-old daughter and over $117,000 in debt. Mabel reorganized the ranch, sold half interests in her cattle to Kentucky investors, and by 1883, the Day Cattle Ranch was the largest fully fenced ranch in Texas. She'd enclosed 85,000 acres. For context, that's roughly 133 square miles, an area larger than the city of Denver. And she wasn't the only one. Up in the Texas Panhandle, the XIT Ranch was taking shape. In 1879, the Texas legislature had appropriated 3 million acres of panhandle land to finance construction of a new state capital in Austin. 3 million acres. That's roughly 4,700 square miles, larger than the entire state of Connecticut. In 1882, a syndicate led by Chicago businessmen Charles and John Farwell struck a deal. They would build the Capitol building in exchange for those 3 million acres. The XIT Ranch stretched 200 miles from north to south along the New Mexico border, varying in width from 20 to 30 miles. It covered parts of 10 counties: Dallam, Hartley, Oldham, Deaf Smith, Palmer, Castro, Bailey, Lamb, Cochran, and Hockley. And starting in the mid-1880s, they fenced the entire thing. The project was staggering. They freighted 210 carloads of wire from Dodge City, Kansas, a distance of roughly 250 miles. They used 101,200 cedar posts, a carload of staples. By 1886, the XIT had 781 miles of fence in place. The west fence line ran for 260 miles without a single turn. The east line stretched 275 miles. Eventually, they added cross fences to create 94 separate pastures. The total fence length reached 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles of barbed wire on a single ranch. The cost? $171,000, over $5 million in today's money. But for a ranch that size, it was worth it. At its peak, the XIT ran 150,000 head of cattle, employed 100 to 150 cowboys, and maintained over 1,000 horses. It was the largest fenced ranch in the world. But here's what the big ranchers didn't always respect. Some of that land they were fencing wasn't theirs. Texas had entered the Union in possession of its own public lands. That meant vast stretches of territory belonged to all Texans, legally designated for public use. But when ranchers strung barbed wire, they didn't always check property lines carefully. They'd fence in water holes that weren't on their land. They'd run fences across public roads, cutting off access for travelers. They'd enclose entire sections of public domain, blocking smaller cattlemen from grass and water their herds needed to survive. In some cases, they'd fence around smaller farms and ranches, trapping families inside barbed wire enclosures without permission. The cattlemen who didn't own land, the ones who'd always relied on open range, were furious. Then came the summer of 1883. A severe drought hit Texas, water sources dried up, grass withered, cattle were dying, and everywhere the landless cattlemen looked, barbed wire blocked their access to the few remaining water holes and decent grazing land. So they fought back. They formed groups with names like the Owls, the Javelinas, and the Blue Devils. Armed bands of cowboys who rode out at night with wire cutters. They called themselves fence cutters. Others called them nippers, and they went to work. The fence cutters were organized and methodical. They'd post armed guards while others cut. They'd sever miles of fence in a single night. Often they'd leave warnings nailed to fence posts. Rebuild this fence, and there'll be consequences. On September 13, 1883, the Austin Weekly Statesman reported that fence cutting had arrived in Coleman County. Mabel Day's ranch was hit hard. Cutters severed 5 miles of her fence and tacked a notice to her gatepost threatening the largest coroner's inquest in that pasture ever held in Texas if she rebuilt. She rebuilt it anyway. They cut 10 more miles in broad daylight. She sent armed men to protect her fences. The cutters outnumbered them. She lost over 100 miles of fence. Across Texas, the damage mounted. By fall 1883, fence cutting was reported in more than half the counties in the state. The destruction formed a belt running north to south through central Texas, the ranching frontier. The financial toll was devastating. $20 million in damage, roughly $620 million today. In Brown County alone, damage exceeded $1 million. The Fort Worth Gazette reported that tax valuations had declined $30 million statewide. At least 3 men were killed in clashes between fence cutters and ranchers. Texas Ranger Ben Warren died in the conflict. Some pastures were burned, cattle were scattered, entire communities were torn apart as neighbors chose sides. The conflict revealed a fundamental divide in Texas. Those who believed the open range was a right versus those who believed private property was sacred. On October 15, 1883, Governor John Ireland called a special session of the Texas legislature to convene on January 8, 1884. The debate was fierce. Petitions flooded in from both sides. Emotions ran high. One legislator called the fence cutters the ragtag and bobtail ruffians, these hellhounds of Texas. But what about the ranchers who'd illegally fenced public land? The legislature tried to balance the competing interests. On one hand, they needed to protect property rights and restore order. On the other, they couldn't ignore the legitimate grievances of cattlemen who'd been cut off from public resources. The solution was imperfect but pragmatic. Fence cutting became a felony, punishable by 1 to 5 years in prison. Malicious pasture burning carried 2 to 5 years, but, and this was crucial, illegally fencing public land or land belonging to others was only a misdemeanor. Violators had 6 months to remove illegal fences. If fences crossed public roads, ranchers had to install gates every 3 miles and maintain them. The message was clear. The state sided with the big ranchers, but with conditions. The legislation largely worked. Large-scale fence cutting declined by the mid-1880s, though sporadic incidents continued during droughts. Mabel Day rebuilt her fences. She continued operating the ranch even after remarrying. By the time of her death in 1906, she'd paid off all debts and left her daughter a profitable debt-free operation. The fence-cutting war was over, and with it, the era of the open range ended. The impact of barbed wire extended far beyond Texas. On the Great Plains from Kansas to Montana, railroads became massive purchasers of barbed wire. They needed to keep cattle off the tracks. A collision between a locomotive and a herd of cattle could derail a train and kill passengers. Railroad companies fenced thousands of miles of track. The wire protected both trains and livestock. Farmers in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas used barbed wire to protect crops from free-roaming cattle. Before barbed wire, conflicts between farmers and ranchers were constant. After barbed wire, the boundaries were clear. But barbed wire also accelerated the closing of Native American lands. Tribes had never envisioned a culture that would claim to own land, let alone fence it off with sharp metal wire. When Comanche Chief Standing Deer passed through Charles Goodnight's fenced ranch in the 1880s and got lost, he told Goodnight he'd lived in this country all his life, but could no longer find his way. Before, no fences, Standing Deer reportedly said. Now, fences everywhere. The invention also changed cattle breeding. Before barbed wire, cattle roamed freely and bred indiscriminately. Longhorns dominated because they could survive in the wild. But with fenced pastures, ranchers could control breeding. They introduced Hereford and Angus cattle, breeds that produced better beef but couldn't survive on the open range. Within 20 years, the Longhorn nearly disappeared. The cattle drives ended too. When Kansas passed strict quarantine laws in the mid-1880s, blocking Texas cattle from crossing the state to avoid spreading Texas fever, the final trails closed. By 1890, the frontier was officially declared closed by the U.S. Census Bureau. Barbed wire had carved the West into private parcels. Joseph Glidden lived to see it all. He died in DeKalb, Illinois on October 9, 1906, at the age of 93. He donated 63 acres of his homestead to establish the Northern Illinois State Normal School, which opened in 1898. Today, it's Northern Illinois University. In Texas, his Frying Pan Ranch, established in 1881 near Amarillo to demonstrate the effectiveness of barbed wire, proved the invention worked at scale. The ranch ran 12,000 head of cattle and used wire brought by wagon from the railhead at Dodge City. Glidden's business partner, Isaac Elwood, became equally wealthy. Jacob Heisch, despite losing the patent battle, also prospered by manufacturing his own barbed wire designs. But Glidden's winner design became the standard. Over 400 different barbed wire patents were eventually issued. Some designs had 2-point barbs. Others had 4-point barbs. Some used flat ribbons instead of round wire. There were variations with different twist patterns, different spacing, different barb styles. Today, antique barbed wire is a collector's item. The Texas Barbed Wire Collectors Association maintains its archives at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas. The Kansas Barbed Wire Museum in La Crosse displays hundreds of varieties. Each design tells a story. Each variation represents someone's attempt to improve on Glidden's original concept. But none achieved what the winner accomplished. Barbed wire is still manufactured today, largely unchanged from Glidden's 1874 design. It remains essential to agriculture worldwide. Billions of pounds have been produced. It's strung across millions of miles of fence lines on every continent except Antarctica. In 1991, Texas designated the chuck wagon as the official state vehicle, but they could just as easily have chosen barbed wire as the state symbol, because nothing changed Texas faster or more completely than those sharp metal barbs twisted between two strands of wire. The open range, that vast unfenced grassland stretching from the Rio Grande to the Canadian border, lasted barely 20 years after barbed wire arrived. The cattle drives ended. The Longhorn nearly vanished. Small cattlemen were pushed out. Corporate ranches took over. Was it progress? Was it theft? Was it the inevitable march of civilization? The answer depends on who you ask. For ranchers like Mabel Day, barbed wire meant survival. It protected her investment, secured her property, and allowed her to run a profitable business. For landless cattlemen, it meant the end of a way of life. It meant watching waterholes and grazing lands, resources they'd used for decades, disappear behind fences they weren't allowed to cross. For Native Americans, it meant one more barrier, one more way their traditional lands were carved up and controlled. For farmers, it meant protection. It meant they could finally grow crops without cattle trampling through. For the cattle themselves, well, cattle don't care about philosophy, but those early barbed wire designs had brutally sharp barbs. In bad conditions, cattle could get snagged on wire and die by the thousands. Later designs softened the barbs. Modern barbed wire is far less dangerous. But in the 1880s, the Devil's Rope earned its name honestly. Today, if you drive through the Texas Panhandle, you can still see remnants of the XIT Ranch. The land has been subdivided into smaller ranches and farms, but the descendants of that original fencing project remain. In Dalhart, Texas, at the northern edge of where the XIT once stretched, the town hosts the annual XIT Rodeo and Reunion every August. It features the world's largest free barbecue. The XIT Museum preserves the ranch's history. Several businesses in the area still use XIT in their names. XIT Communications provides phone service to the region. An ironic twist, since cowboys on the original XIT Ranch once used the barbed wire fences as primitive telephone lines, clipping their phones directly to the wire. In Coleman County, portions of the Day Ranch remain in operation, though much smaller than Mabel Day's original 85,000-acre spread. And in DeKalb, Illinois, a historical marker commemorates Joseph Glidden's home and workshop, the place where a 60-year-old farmer with a modified coffee mill changed the American West. The invention was simple: two strands of wire twisted together with sharp metal barbs locked in place, but its impact was profound. Barbed wire didn't just fence in cattle, it fenced in an entire era. It ended the age of the open range, the cattle drives, the frontier as Americans had known it. In less than 20 years, from 1874 to the early 1890s, millions of miles of barbed wire crisscrossed the West. The landscape transformed, the economy shifted, the culture changed, all because a farmer in Illinois looked at a thorny fence rail and thought, "I can do better." He was right, and the West would never be the same.